So universal proxy, I think this panel is interesting because it affects different constituencies. And here we have people. We have a lawyer, proxy solicitor, investment banker that used to be with a proxy advisory firm, someone from a proxy advisory firm, and then an investor. Just by a show of hands, does everyone know if you know what universal proxy is, will you raise your hand? Okay, so a mixed bag. So universal proxy rules, which went into effect just recently, was passed by SEC in 2021 and applied to the first contested meetings, September of 2022, solely mean that when a dissident tries to nominate and elect directors, that the issuer and the activist, provided they comply with some guidelines, have to both put all of the names of the nominees on both of their cards. Before that, if you were an activist, you would put your nominees on and then name the other directors that you weren't supporting that were running for election, or in a control contest, you would just put down signs your own nominees. Institutional investors and proxy advisory firms and even some retail investors didn't like this concept because you couldn't properly pick and choose a mixed bag of different nominees. Now, there were ways to get around this, but it was difficult for the standard investor. So for us, it's good to have here, and I'll let the panelists introduce themselves and sort of provide their initial take on how universal proxy may change their own role in the process, if at all, or it may not change the role in any way, and what they think the impact will be. And as we're going through, since it's a new topic, we already heard one question asked about universal proxy. Feel free to just raise your hand if you have a question. We're happy to discuss this and take this conversation however you'd like. A bunch of us spoke with this the other night and could go on ad nauseum just talking with each other. So.
Yeah, we could try to keep this as fun and fluid as possible. Hi, everyone. I'm Andy Freedman. I run the shareholder activism group at Olshan, Frome, Wolosky. So I advise on the activist side of things, never on the corporate or company defense side of things. Starboard, Elliott, some of the top name activist investors are some of my clients. Probably run about 750 proxy fights in the last 20 years. Helped put about 2,000 new board members on public company boards. The universal proxy has been a welcome development. It's kind of about time that the system got right-sized, where all the nominees from both the dissident slate and a company slate are on both the company ballot and the dissident ballot that gets sent out to shareholders. So from the standpoint of shareholder democracy, we're in a much better place, and we're working through right now in some of our very first proxy fights just how the universal proxy system will play out in public company America. But so far so good. What we're seeing as trends is that, on the one hand, minority slate proxy fights, so those proxy fights where the dissident, the activist, if you will, is seeking to elect somewhere less than majority or control of the public company board of directors, it's a bit easier in those instances for the dissident to get traction for their candidates. In the first one, my firm has been advising on the first two of the universal proxy fights to date, and it's Land and Buildings at AMCO was the first one, and then one that got withdrawn, but it was Capital Returns LLC at Argo. But what we saw, I believe, in the Land and Buildings fight, where one of the Land and Buildings nominees got elected, is that there's more of a, let me just say, low-hanging fruit, troubled directors that have lingering issues, whether they're over tenured, whether they are overboarded, whether ISS or Glass Lewis have pointed out some issues with certain directors. It's harder to shelter those what I'll call low-hanging fruit or problem directors in the universal proxy system. In Land and Buildings, in fact, the one where I believe it was ISS who gave a nod for a recommendation for the dissident candidate, and I think Glass Lewis supported both of the company nominees in that fight. but, and would love to hear Mark's take on how he approaches it. But what happens is if there's a company that's underperforming and has governance issues, the bad director used to be able to be sheltered in the old system, because it was very difficult if you're nominating 1 or 2 directors in, say, an annually elected board where 8 directors are up, and you could only vote for on the dissident proxy card for the dissident nominee. It was very difficult proposition for a proxy advisory firm to recommend on the dissident card when so many votes would be left hanging. Because if they recommend for 2 directors, and they want to, then it means institutions and shareholders would be effectively disenfranchised with respect to the other 5, 6 seats up for election. So what we saw instead is where ISS or Glass Lewis wanted to support a dissident in those situations, they would recommend a withhold, so it's kind of an inverse support for the dissident, but it didn't work out to get the dissident elected in many instances. This is, with the universal proxy, it's a much more direct system of being able to support directors and being able to target directors, and I think we're going to see a lot more of the minority slate type contests, and I'll leave it now for John to introduce himself if I've gone on long.
No. I'm John Grau. I'm the head of a proxy solicitation firm, InvestorCom, and most of our activism work is working for the activist, and just agreeing with everything Andy said, and I just want all of my fellow panelists to jump in and make this a really engaging conversation, and disagreeing with anything that I say or anyone says. When universal proxy first came out, people started asking me, well, are you getting 20 calls a day from new activists wanting to do proxy contests? And really, that's not the case. I mean, I'm finding that universal proxy is a tool that is, or not a tool, but is a mechanism by which I'm seeing activists have an advantage when they're running a short slate proxy contest. It's bringing, raising the bar for management teams when we're comparing nominees. The weaker management nominees really have to clean themselves up, or they're really going to face issues when they're up against activists. And so I really see activists having an advantage in contested proxies when they're up against very well qualified dissident candidates. So I think it makes Mark's job very much more challenging, detailed, but it's not a, it was never an all or none choice when choosing on proxy cards completely, but it makes it a much more complicated analysis for some folks. So it makes it, in my opinion, and disagree anyone if you want, but
I think it makes it easier, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
All right.
I think for us, John, as proxy solicitors, and Bruce, we're always given a set of rules, and then our job is to try and manipulate or game those rules to the benefit of whoever our client may be. So all it's really done is it changed the rules. And yes, I agree, for minority representation, getting that first seat on a board, all other things held equal, it's easier. If you're going for control of a board, I think it makes your job a ton more difficult. And unless anyone has anything else on this, I wanted to have Mark go first because I want to ask you, Chris, a question about what Mark says.
Good.
Wow.
Well, I was also going to say, and maybe we are like-minded from your days at ISS, but I also think it makes our job easier. The more difficult part was trying to choose, team A or team B or, one card or the other, and trying to game theory out all the repercussions of how that vote could go or couldn't go, because it was a either or scenario with the card or the not card. And that didn't mean you had to support, say, all 4 dissident nominees. But if you wanted to support 2, if you wanted to support only partial change, you had to think about how the vote tallies were going to come in, how your recommendation was going to be taken across a shareholder base. Now we can be very specific with what we want to recommend and what we think the right change is that needs to happen. So from that perspective, it's a lot easier. I think where it's a little bit more difficult then is it drops the considerations to more of a personal level, a director by director basis, where now it's really incumbent on us to understand things like boardroom dynamics, to really vet all of the dissident candidates on a personal kind of basis. And that piece of it, I guess, is something we've always done to some degree. I think it just puts more of an emphasis on that part of it.
It's almost like a political campaign in a sense, which is what I was
they've always
implying
been.
before when I said it was a little more difficult for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, it was the unintended consequences. So guys
Right.
like Jordan would always say, if you put your clients, ISS clients, on the company card, even though you want to support, you want some change, you're going to get unintended consequences.
Yeah.
So
You're not going to be able to direct your clients to the exact, in your
End game
opinion,
that you want.
outcome that you wanted, and I would get from Birch and everybody else, right? Yeah. So I think it makes it easier that way.
Maybe just one example to kind of
Yeah, go ahead.
illustrate it too. I always think of as a classic example at ADP where Pershing Square went for 3 seats. We ended up wrecking for all 3 of Pershing's nominees, including Bill Ackman. And in ISS's report, they basically said in their report, we think Bill Ackman should be on this board, but they didn't want to recommend on the dissident card for Bill Ackman because they weren't supportive of his other 2 nominees. And they were worried about the outcome of how, essentially you're still taking votes away from certain incumbents. So the way they tried to get there was to say, we think you should withhold votes from this incumbent member on the company card so that you can make room for Bill Ackman. Now, the problem with that is in a vacuum.
It wasn't working. That's the one I was referring to.
Okay.
Yeah,
that didn't. So
it
ultimately,
didn't work.
he did not get on the board. And the problem with that recommendation on the withhold, and I think we've done it a couple times on Glass Lewis's side. We really tried to avoid that, even in the 2-card system or the kind of old system. There's still 2 cards. But if you say, okay, if 100% of shareholders follow my recommendation, you wouldn't get Bill Ackman on the board. You would just get this one person off the board, because Bill Ackman still has to get some number of being whatever it is, the 12th highest or the 10th highest votes to get on the board. So in this case, under universal proxy card system, very likely ISS would have just recommended for Bill Ackman and the other 9 incumbents, or 10, 11, whatever it was, and in combination with our recommendation, he probably very easily would have gotten on that board. So from a higher level too, I should say, Glass Lewis, we're very happy, not only because I think it does ultimately make our job a little bit easier, we can be more specific, but I think it's like what Andy was saying too, this is the way it really should be. This is the common sense way that it probably always should have been. This is the way that shareholders can generally vote if they're at the meeting in person. So it's just kind of normalizing that and right-sizing that on the proxy piece of it.
I would agree with that completely. It was just an accident of history and technology and conflicts between federal proxy laws and state law. So I don't think there's any legitimate, retort against UPC. If you read that, it's wrong. And it generally benefits companies because I'm old enough to remember that Ackman versus Target stores, and companies could always provide a universal proxy card. It would take some effort, but every time they were asked in these high-profile situations, every single company turned it down, right? So that tells me that it likely makes it more likely to get some representation.
Yeah.
As far as what Mark and I used to do, Mark
That's-
does now. I had a prong two in our analytical framework that specifically said look at each candidate, right? When I was there, we never did sorry, this is going in and out. We never did the withhold, backdoor method. But then if you didn't do it that way, you had the unintended consequences. So it was like pulling your hair out. And now people just get to vote
For who they
as
want.
the man on the street would expect to
Right.
be able to vote. So it does make it more personal now for the activists that our friends here represent, because they typically have to target, or should target, I would think. Or do you agree with that? You have to target an incumbent specifically.
Well, I think now it almost, I think we'll still see activists that are targeting, but before you had to specifically target and say these people shouldn't be on, all three of them are really bad, because you're actually telling holders you can't vote for these people on the card. It does leave it open now a little more, but as an activist, you do want to consolidate the against votes on those limited amounts. We'd likely still see that. I think for me, what I'm most curious about is it's always easier to say something after you leave an organization or a side of the wall. And so right now, Mark's in a tricky spot as we've called him out on this concept that Glass Lewis and ISS both have these sort of two-pronged tests in contested elections. One, is change warranted, or is there something that needs changing on the boardroom? And then, who are the people that are most qualified to bring about this change? So curious to hear Mark's position, but also for Chris, it's easier to say, do you think they just need to scrap that out, and should it just be, okay, there are 10 director spots open and 12 nominees? Should it just be the 10 most qualified, regardless of where they're coming from? Or do you think there still needs to be that sort of case for change?
So I'll let the person who created the framework answer first.
Okay. It's a great question. And a lot of times what we did was not identify incumbents. We just said, Peltz and two of his nominees should be elected, and then we let clients decide if they were to follow that, which incumbents they weren't going to support. But as you said, with the math, the ballot math, it behooves you as an activist to try to target, someone so that shareholders will accumulate their against votes against that one candidate rather than splitting it. So I think you guys know the math better than me. I mean, isn't that the right thing to do? Yeah.
Yes, it is. I'm just curious if we're going to see, and Mark, maybe it's
Yeah.
not this year, but in the future, will we see the recommendations start to shift?
Well, I think kind of what you're asking is this framework. So when UPC got announced that it's going to be adopted going forward, both ISS, Chris 3.0, I think, Cristiano, who heads the group at ISS, and us, we put out some sort of form of public comments to say, look, this isn't really going to change our framework. We're still going to require this. The first prong in this test is that the activist needs to make a compelling case for change. So generally that involves some sort of quantitative analysis on performance. It could be TSR, underlying financial metrics. There's got to be some clear evidence that this company has underperformed its peers, its benchmark, or there's can be some serious governance concerns. And then the prong two is, okay, well, who are the best nominees then amongst both slates to kind of be on the board to address these issues? Part of that also you would expect comes with some sort of plan or specific initiatives that an activist would have its nominees oversee or implement. And so I think there's a fair discussion to have around whether that framework is potentially too rigid, because we both sort of talked about this urge, I think is how Cristiano mentioned it, is resisting the urge to just jump to the last step, which is who are the best 10 out of the 12 or 14 nominees to be on this board. And in some ways, I think you can probably make an argument that that's maybe how it should be. That's just the kind of commonsensical man on the streets version of maybe approaching it. And I think we've tried to maintain a framework, at least in the first two instances that we've seen, where we're still going to try to kind of hold true and go through our steps in our order of operations before we just jump. I think it's. Sorry, I think it's ideally somewhat of a holistic approach versus a order of operations type of thing that we end up getting to. On Aimco, it's probably too many wrinkles and nuances to cover here, so we could talk about it later too. But the vote obviously didn't go the way that we went. We had a disagreement, ISS and Glass Lewis. So I happened to write that opinion or recommendation on Aimco, where we ultimately, on the first instance, sided with both the company's nominees. ISS recommended for one of the dissident nominees who ultimately got elected. And I would agree that from kind of a 50,000 foot level, that's was very clear from the beginning, I think, that it was sort of the easy, common sense answer based on some governance concerns lingering from a prior. It was a spin-off situation as well, so there's a lot of context and nuance here. But ultimately, we didn't find that there was really a performance case for change just yet. And then the other aspect was the company had made some changes, including to its board composition, where looking at Jonathan Litt's two nominees, one, we didn't find any additive value at all whatsoever based on not having any industry experience right off the bat. It was a steel industry analyst who,
Tell us what you
getting
really
on a
think.
REIT. Yep. So yep. It's nice to be able to talk about these situations.
He
after
happens
the fact.
to be with us today.
Well, it was she. She seems like a very bright, analytical person who would challenge a board, but it just wasn't the right fit here, we didn't think. Is maybe the better, correct way to say it. And their more compelling nominee had skills that were somewhat duplicative, just because one of the newest directors was essentially fulfilling the role that they articulated this nominee would do on the board. So looking at it from that perspective, if we didn't see a really clear case for change based on underperformance, and we also have found that their one kind of qualified nominee wasn't really going to add a whole lot more to the board. So if, we kind of view it through our framework. We didn't get there to say, okay, this is enough to knock this person off and knock the other person off. Now, it's another interesting situation because it's a classified board situation, so there's only 2 or 3 nominees up this year. Had the entire board been up, we had governance concerns about some of the things the company had done historically pre-spinoff and even post-spinoff. But we would have attached those concerns or centered them on other members of the board of directors who happened not to be up this year. So we found it less, less, I guess, correct to knock off someone who maybe was complicit in some of that, only to put on someone who is going to be duplicative when there's no real clear case for change in our eyes. Now, again, that's all kind of, we can argue with so many of those points along the way, and there's reasonable.
Yeah, doesn't the classified board in and of itself that the board put in place, shouldn't that in a way act to be kind of a negative as you're looking through things and help make a part of the case for change? I mean, I think what we saw is, and I was worried because when I interviewed Cristiano Guerra at a 13D conference a few months back, we were talking about this very point in the framework, and with what level of rigidity would that framework apply? What if you have just a preeminent all-star dissident candidate, an obvious on the activist side, and on the company side, there's one over tenured, whatever the case may be, that makes a candidate on the company side, an obvious for a change out. Why do you have to make a case for change when such a change seems on its face to be so apparent? And I was worried, but then when I saw the ISS report, I had a little bit of hope going down kind of the path, and as there have only been 2. It's way too early to draw any conclusions on where things are going with universal proxy. But I did see that there was going to be some room for fluidity, and it could be malleable. And it's nice to see that the dissident got the nod there.
I would just add real quick too, sorry, on that case, the other challenge that we have that hasn't been fixed yet for proxy advisors is, at the end of these reports that we're issuing on a very nuanced, complex, multifaceted proxy contest, we're issuing one recommendation to a whole host of different types of clients in terms of their priorities, what's more important to them, what the size of their stake is in the company, how well they know the company, what their views are of the management team, the other directors. So I will say, if you read our report, it was also kind of very apparent that we sort of led the horse to water in a way to say, if these sorts of governance issues are a big concern to you, as they are to us, and you want to use this opportunity here to get this person off the board, like without saying it explicitly, we sort of said that would be in a reasonable position as well. But ultimately, based on our framework that we said we would uphold through UPC, this is where we come out on that. So, take it or leave it, which is always our recommendation. I know it has potentially more of an impact on that. It sort of depends on how clients use it, but it's another aspect of it.
So I think one thing interesting, and this is where I think Keith lends a valuable perspective here, because all of us are advisors or make recommendations. So for you, Keith, how do you approach this as an investor, and how do you frame this issue? How are you looking at this situation, generally, and then for yourself, and do you think the approach of proxy advisory firms is right or should be changed too? In addition,
I think the framework question is the most important question. And as an investor, which is really all I am, right? I have no benefit unless there's value created for the shareholders. That's all I am, right? I'm not getting paid any advisory fees. I'm not getting paid anything else. At the end of the day, I just want to see the value created be greater. And my perspective is that it always starts at the top. If you've got great leaders in the boardroom who can challenge management, who can really make decisions, who can think objectively about the situation, that's better. So that's my fundamental, North Star. That's a better situation for everybody. So the framework of the UPC gets me excited if it's as Mark and Chris were just articulating, and as Andy said, yes, this is what I would like it to be, right? If we say there's 11 seats or 9 seats or 10 seats, here are 15 people make it up to choose from, who are the best people to plug in there? To me, that's a win-win for all shareholders. Unfortunately, the way human nature is, the incumbents don't view it that way. And where you get into this really fascinating hypocritical dialogue is this discussion about dissension and you need the board to work smoothly and all this stuff. The claim is we need the board to work smoothly, yet we need a diverse series of perceptions and opinions, right? That's what we want. Okay, so think about what that means. Ideally, what you want are really independent, objective views. I personally believe that if someone sits on a board for a certain amount of time, and you can argue what that is it 7 years, is it 10 years, is it whatever, but at some point, someone that came to the board to be an independent, objective voice has now been paid $2.5 million to sit on a board and basically bless everything that has happened. And to assume that that everything has gone right because of that person's seat, I think it's a false assumption. So as an investor, I would love the paradigm, love it, to be that very simple, here's our roster. We want to fill it up with the best players.
I had a question for you guys. Sure. We know activist hedge funds are going to use the UPC. I mean, they have to, and it's good for them. The bigger question is, are we going to see gadflies or ESG focused investors, 14A8 proposal people, put people onto onto the ballot, or the T. Rowe Prices and Fidelities of the world. Because I remember going through this with Proxy Access. I know they're very different things, and it sat on 100 panels. And my prediction then was nobody was going to use it for various different reasons, and they haven't.
You were right.
I got lucky, I guess. But
were right.
what do you guys think?
Look, I get asked that a lot. I think there's this narrative that's being promulgated by the company-side advisors that this universal proxy regime is somehow going to open the floodgates to these gadfly proxy fights. What that narrative or point of view doesn't take into account is there is a lot of time, resources, and energy that goes into running a proxy contest. The universal proxy is just a mechanism for how the voting comes in. So let's not forget, to start a proxy contest, you have to nominate a slate of directors, and that is not just simply giving a company to the corporate secretary saying, here are 3 bios, we're nominating these 3 directors, and we expect you to put them on your proxy. That's a $60,000 to $120,000 endeavor, an undertaking by the activist, by whoever it may be. Maybe it's one of these ESG-focused firms that decides to nominate. I think we'll see some, because there be opportunities or situations where it's attractive for them to be able to use the platform of having a nominee to send a stronger message than, say, a 14A8 shareholder proposal. It's obviously a way to show more conviction, to get a stronger referendum about an issue that someone feels strongly about. But this idea, this notion that all of a sudden we're going to see hundreds of proxy fights, the narrative got to such a point where I have prominent activist clients that will go unnamed here, calling me up after seeing a Wall Street Journal article and saying, wait, so we can just put in our nomination notice and the company has to put the nominees on their ballot and that's all we have to do? If there's a situation where we don't want to go in full bore with fight letters and decks and this, that, we can just nominate a couple great candidates. And it's led to this misconception that it's not that. There's, like, running a fight is a deeply intensive process, and you can't really get around that.
Right, but I think that you are going to see some that aren't as deep-pocketed that will try and do a bare-bones solicitation and try and target some huge company as a PR move, knowing that, okay, how can we do this as cheap as possible? We ask a lawyer, we just want a bare-bone proxy statement, and then when you say, when you get to the point of the activist has to deliver or solicit votes from 2/3 of the outstanding shares, some are going to try and find very unique ways to do that. If you get a proxy solicitor to send out an email to institutional shareholders representing 2/3 of the outstanding shares, you may say, well, look, I complied with that. Now, the company's lawyers, if they have Wachtell or someone on, or Vincent may then say, no, you did not. You need to actually mail to them. And then you could have this back and forth fight. And I think that's part of why issuers fought this so hard is they were always had an advantage because they can spend their own money, right? The company's money, and they can keep sending out mailings, call shareholders at their home, down to one single share. Any activist that we work for has to make a decision with their own money. So you don't, most of the time, mail to all shareholders or even a majority of the actual shareholders. You may mail to only shareholders owning 10,000 plus shares, which means the company knew they were the only ones able to collect votes from these retail shareholders that were overwhelmingly supportive of the board anyway. Now we have meme stocks, we have weird, crazy groups of retail shareholders. There are things that are cutting in potentially to issuers' sort of free votes in these retail shareholders. And now issuers are pissed because now the dissident nominees are on the card too. So I think that percentage we're going to see sort of shifting, and I think that's part of why we've seen such opposition.
No, I was just going to add that I agree with both of you. I think I think we'll see few gadflies, if you want to use that term, but I think we will see an occasional ESG fund use universal proxy as opposed to a 14A8 proposal if they actually do want to, rather than put up a non-binding shareholder proposal, if they really do want to put or attempt to put up a director up for election and, really make a strong case to get a company's attention. So I think we'll see some of that. But really, at the end of the day, as Andy mentioned, there is significant cost involved. Even, regardless of the size of the company, it's still, whether it's a couple of $100,000 or if it's even, $30,000, $40,000, $75,000, the activist is still spending money for advisors, for mailings, even if it's universal proxy.
Yep. Yep.
Do you want to see if there are any questions from the group? We don't want to, hold people up to getting to happy hour quicker. So if anyone has any questions, we're happy to answer here or after. In the back?
George, get my steps in here.
And I apologize if this is a basic question. Most people may already know, but I don't. So I just wanted to ask, why are proxy contests so expensive? And do you foresee universal proxy cheapening the cost or lowering the cost of them? And what is the average cost of a proxy contest, if there is one?
No, it's a great question. These days, proxy fights are incredibly time-consuming and cost-intensive. They run anywhere from, I think at the lowest end, when I'm talking to certain clients who want to run a very bare-bone proxy fight, we still quote all in with the various advisors they need to have engaged, $400K. So the very low end, $400,000, and then upwards of, if the rug got pulled out from under Disney's fight with Tryon today, but that one, each side would have incurred, let's say that Nelson Peltz would have probably spent $3 million, 2.5, $3 million, maybe more. So at the high end, I think before that, his fight at Procter & Gamble was the most expensive one on record, with fees. And why are they expensive? Because it's a campaign. I think John alluded to it earlier. You said it's like a political campaign.
Yeah.
Political campaigns are expensive. It's expensive when you have two sides duking it out for supremacy. And every day there's a press release calling out one thing or the other, setting the record straight this way or the other way. So that all comes with costs. There's a cost to just issuing the press release, let alone how the substance gets in that press release.
Andy, if I could just add one thing to that. He's speaking specifically about the costs of the activist. The cost to the company, to the shareholder, is multiplicative of that.
3 to 8 times, yeah.
At least. And if you're talking about Exxon, and Mark and I were just talking about Procter & Gamble, these larger companies, as a shareholder, it's offensive to me how much money is literally spent on this battle of egos in the boardroom and the message that it sends to shareholders. But in answer to your question, we went on a proxy contest where we didn't even send out proxies, and the company had spent $5.8 million. So,
What's the least you've ever spent?
that we have ever spent?
One that went to a vote. Or have you, or mail. Yeah, or mail.
That where we went to a vote. The least expense was
What do you
$500.
what do you expect to
Yeah,
spend?
about $550,000. Just like you said, and that was a small one. That was a small one. But the real cost is the cost to the shareholder. It's not the cost to the activist. It's the cost to the shareholder. And that, to me, is really the whole essence of what needs to happen here. Boards have to actually look themselves in the mirror and say, why are we fighting? Why are we blowing this amount of money? For companies that have 10% operating margins, if you're spending $20 million, that's $200 million of revenue. Or you really think that's in the best interest of the company? You really think that's in the best interest of your culture? And for companies that lose money, I don't even know how to do that math as to how much revenue they have to generate. So, maybe this whole universal proxy thing will hopefully bring some people to reason that this concept of what governance is and what it matters is it is trying to get people on the same page to drive things forward as opposed to just spend millions of dollars to protect boardroom insular egos, which I think everyone in this panel, if you spoke to them privately, not suggesting that they do so publicly, I think everybody would agree.
That was one of the predictions too when UPC came out. Some had that it would result in more settlements. So
It's
if you could look
It's
into
happening.
crystal ball, I was going to
Yep.
say, yep. Have you guys seen that on?
Yeah,
on
yeah,
here?
it's
'Cause
happening.
obviously we're generally unaware of that. You know,
Yeah.
we only look at something that goes the distance to a vote.
Yeah, we're going long, and I'm sorry, but I'll be quick. Their settlements are in the making. Much more so, the past 2 seasons have been marked by the pendulum shifts every few years. One way, a couple years, management has the upper hand, and they did because there was a lot of deference given to boards during the pandemic, maybe rightly so. Now we're in a place where the market is where it is. We're on the other side of the pandemic, and we are seeing a lot of early stage settlements that are becoming
So
the norm
not
again.
only UPC, but because of other
Well,
broader market
right,
market
but also
factors,
because of
macro
UPC,
factors.
because they realize on a 1 or 2 person dissonant slate, the dissonant has a pretty damn good chance of success if there's underperformance, some issues with governance, and an obvious director or two that needs to be shaken
And
out.
it's, you know,
And that's what we're telling our public company clients.
it's proven out too on AIMCO so far that, you know, I think historically there was something that usually you wouldn't expect a dissident or activist nominee to get elected unless they needed recommendations from both Glass Lewis and ISS. In this case, the first one, there was a split, and you know, it went. It still went.
It's okay. We're also seeing institutions who are excited at the prospect of using the universal proxy for what it's intended to accomplish. And so I think that for at least this season, you're going to see the pendulum shifting towards the activist side, more settlements. Something we didn't even get into, but I'm fascinated by, is the nomination strategy, because there's a disincentive for activists to over-nominate their slates. They used to over-nominate for leverage and settlement negotiations, discussions, but now when you think about, you have to game theory out what are the chances of success on a 7-member annually elected board that I'm going to win 2, 3, 4, or 5 seats. If I nominate 5, but the cards I'm holding are really only to really be able to win 2, I'm not doing a service to my slate or shareholders, because votes are going to get dispersed at the end of the day, and they're going to get dispersed in a way that you could actually end up with none getting elected, but that's a whole different panel discussion, sorry.
Okay, guys, I want to make sure this SPAC panel gets enough time. That was terrific, though. I like the enthusiasm. Keith, loved it.